Whatever you think of him, it was a remarkable comeback. Whether he will make America great again or lead the West to the appeasement of Russia, but in a macho tone, Donald Trump's re-election in November shook the world. I'm Charlotte Leslie, and I'm the director of the Conservative Middle East Council. Trump's re-election took place against the backdrop of a Middle East once again stricken by the Israel-Palestine conflict. The emergence of Iran, Russia, China, and North Korea garnering support from the so-called Global South, and, connected to all this, a war on the borders of Europe in Ukraine. To some, Trump is the ultimate deal-maker, therefore peace-bringer. To others, he heralds disaster. So what does a Trump presidency mean for the MENA region? Here to discuss this, I'm delighted to be joined by Dr. H.A. Hellyer. Dr. Hellyer is a Senior Associate Fellow in International Security Studies at the Royal United Services Institute, that's RUSI to you and me. He has more than 20 years of experience in governmental, corporate advisory, and academic environments in the West, the Middle East, and Southeast Asia. An author of some 10 books, his career has included tenures at the Brookings Institution, the Foreign and Commonwealth Office, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Dr. Hellyer, welcome.
Good morning, and thank you for the invitation, Charlotte.
Our pleasure. Can I just start by asking, we had a lot of speculation about which way the election was going to fall prior to the election, and to many in the West, the Trump election came as a surprise. Did the Trump victory come as a surprise to the MENA region as a whole?
I don't think it did. I don't think people were banking on it one way or the other outside of Israel. But I think that there was a realization quite early on, I'd say at least 2 years ago, that Trump isn't one to be written off in terms of returning to the White House, partly because of how he's completely captured the Republican Party and used it to further his political ambitions, but also a lack of faith that the Democrats were going to be able to return, particularly considering that Biden insisted on running again until, really quite late in the game. I think had Biden stepped away much earlier, there might have been a lot more reliance in the region on the idea that the Democrats were coming for a second term. But I think that it became quite clear, at least a good year or so ago, that the potential for a second Trump term was certainly there, and I think they tried to calculate accordingly.
Which of the countries were rooting for a Trump victory? To whom is a Trump victory particularly important?
I think the most major country that a Trump victory is important for is Israel. Apart from that, I think that you had within the wider Arab world the building of relationships with Democrats as well as Republicans. And I think they were ready for either one. And I think that they could see good potential with either one. And certainly the stability of a democratic administration coming back in, reliability, consistency. I think a lot of governments in the region preferred that. As I said, there were one or two outliers. I think that the Moroccans, given their experience with Trump last time and the recognition of Moroccan sovereignty over Western Sahara, would have been an outlier in this regard. The Israelis, with the increased shift to the right and the far right within the Israeli political spectrum, and the desire to annex large parts of the West Bank and go down a more Ben-Gvir Smotrich kind of line, and that would have been far more preferable as a potential route if Trump took office. And of course, since he's won, you've seen very clearly that there's been a lot of fanfare from Netanyahu's government in that regard. But broadly speaking, I think that stability is what the main powers in the region look for when it comes to the United States. Support for international order and a rules-based order. They were severely disappointed by the Biden administration, of course, especially over the past year with regards to Israel's war on Gaza. But I don't think they thought that the Trump administration would be tremendously better. I think they just prepared quite well in their minds for either eventuality.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, and I'm speaking to Dr. H.A. Hellyer, Senior Associate Fellow in International Security Studies at RUSI. And looking at Saudi Arabia, Saudi's relationship with the Democrats had its ups and downs, shall we say. What was
Yes,
the relationship like by the time the election came along? And do we know much about a Harris-Saudi relationship? We're talking hypotheticals, but it's an
of
interesting.
course. So, of course, when Biden first came in, there was all this trepidation around how are the Democrats under Biden going to engage with the Saudis, particularly public statements that Biden made vis-a-vis MBS himself and Saudi Arabia. I think they got over that hurdle. And I think that that was very clear when you saw Biden engage directly over the past year a deal over the finish line with regards to a US-Saudi security arrangement. And of course, there was all this talk around normalization with the Israelis. I think that sort of died a few months back, irrespective of what Biden said yesterday. The Trump factor, though, is something that the Saudis are going to be interested in exploring. I don't think they were rooting so much for a Trump victory as they were ready for either case. So you saw, for example, very quickly after the US election, a very prominent Saudi official, head of the Public Investment Fund, sitting next to Trump in Madison Square Garden. And just a couple of days later, I think it was. So those relationships obviously exist. They're quite strong. But I don't think that Saudi has sort of put all of its eggs into one basket, as it were. I think that, on the contrary, they're trying to prepare for either a Democrat or a Republican administration. I've been doing that for quite some time. And if I had to guess, who they would have preferred overall, I think they probably would have preferred a Harris administration just because of continuity, stability, more consistency. Trump, of course, is a wild card, but I don't think that they're terribly frantic about the idea of a Trump presidency either.
Just continuing our skip around the region, we've mentioned one of the Abraham Accords countries, Morocco. What about the other two, UAE and Bahrain, which, some could say are in quite a tricky situation with a sort of an all-out war from Israel on Gaza, and obviously after the terror attacks of October the 7th, an increasing feeling amongst Arab populations that this isn't right and the West should intervene. And they're sitting in this kind of quite difficult nexus. What does a Trump administration, which we assume will be probably more impunity for Netanyahu rather than more constraint, what does that mean for them and managing their population?
So those two countries are very different, right? So the UAE, for example, I don't think faces a tremendous amount of dissent from the citizenry vis-a-vis the rulers on issues of foreign policy like this, for example. So and now I'm sure that there are really hot emotions throughout the UAE as there are throughout the Gulf when it comes to this issue, but I don't think that there's a risk of governmental collapse or anything like that. I think that that's rather far-fetched. What you've seen over the past year is that quite regularly, Emirati officials, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, have come out quite clearly and quite publicly about criticizing Israel, calling for a two-state solution, all of that. And I'm sure that part of that is to send a message to their own population that they're drawing a line in the sand. And I think that that is how the Emiratis are going to continue to be. When it comes to the Bahrainis, I think it's different. I think that there's a lot more public outrage over Bahrain's own signing of the accords in the first place. And you saw protests, of course, in Bahrain when the Abraham Accords were signed. And I think that there's a great deal of solidarity with, of course, the Palestinians over not just the past year, but much further back than that. I don't know how much of that is going to be different over the coming 4 years, because of course, as you pointed out, there hasn't been particularly much constraint over the past year anyway from the Biden administration. Having said that, there will be, I think, something different, particularly over the next 12 to 18 months. I think that you'll be seeing annexations take place with regards to parts of the West Bank and probably large parts of the West Bank, if not all of it. as well as a recognition that this is the day after for Gaza, that there will be no political horizon. If there's going to be, quote unquote, an end to the war, it's going to look pretty much like it is now, with IDF troops firmly ensconced in Gaza, with north of Gaza empty of Palestinians, with famine, with disease in the center where most Palestinians will be forced to be. So I think that that's going to be very ugly over the coming year. Not that the past year hasn't been, but this I think will be qualitatively different in terms of particularly coverage. So it'll be interesting to see how the region engages with the Trump administration that will be facilitating that and empowering the Israelis when it comes to Gaza and the West Bank, and at the same time try to have relations with DC.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, and I'm speaking to Dr. H.A. Hellyer, Senior Associate Fellow in International Security Studies at RUSI. We've mentioned Trump's likely approach to the Israel-Palestine conflict. Large numbers of Arabs and Muslims in the US reportedly voted for Trump because they were angry at the Democrats' lack of holding Netanyahu to account and challenge on Israel. Now we hear they're disappointed at Trump's pro-Israel appointments. Should they have seen this coming?
So I want to sort of dig into the numbers a little bit here. I used to be a pollster, I used to be a Gallup, so I pay attention to these sorts of things. So let's put some big numbers out there to begin with. The majority, as far as we can see from the numbers that exist, the majority of Arabs and of Muslims, and of course these are not the same, right? There's not every Muslim in the US is an Arab, and not every Arab in the US is a Muslim. On the contrary, the majority of Muslims in the US are not Arabs, and it's not a majority anymore, but I'd say around sort of half of Arabs in the US are not Muslim, they're Christians. But I would say that the majority of Arab Americans did vote Democrat, and the majority of Muslims and Muslim Americans also voted Democrat. That's one sort of set of data points. The other data point is that had every Muslim American and every Arab American in the United States voted for Harris, she still would have lost. Had they all stayed home, she still would have lost. And what I mean to say by that is that they weren't particularly consequential. They were more consequential in the state of Michigan, but even in Michigan, I think that the outcome would have been the same irrespectively. Now, there were high profile in Michigan Arab American, Muslim American figures that came to a rally with Trump. And of course, the Trump campaign very much boosted the publicity around that, saying that they wanted to vote for Trump. They wanted everybody else to vote for Trump, primarily to quote unquote punish the Democrats. And then thereafter, I think there were one or two press reports going back to that particular sector and asking, how do you feel now, given the appointments? And they expressed disappointment. I don't really know how seriously to take any of that, because I can't imagine that anybody who watched Trump won the first presidential term would imagine that these aren't the sorts of appointments that were going to come in. And when it comes to particularly the Palestinian-Israeli question, I don't think there's going to be much room for optimism when it comes to a Trump White House.
So you're saying it's a slightly confected story and dynamic that we read and see.
So it's not that it's insignificant, because there were significant numbers of Arab Americans and Muslim Americans who stayed home or who voted third party, and there were some who decided to go Trump. I do think that this was over sort of focused on media-wise. I also think that when it comes to the broader picture, not only was it not as consequential as I think people are making out to be, but also when you look at the demographics in the United States, there are much larger pictures for people to look at. What happened with, for example, Latino Americans, what happened to different age groups. And for me, and we're still crunching the numbers, and I think that we will be for a little bit longer. But for me, the biggest takeaway from a Trump victory wasn't that he did particularly well in comparison to his first time out. On the contrary, he got less votes this time round than he got last time round. The bigger story is that Harris did tremendously badly in comparison to how Biden did last time round. And it's not that people defected away as much from the Democrats to vote Republican. So they stayed home in very significant numbers. And given the nature of the American electoral system, that made a tremendous difference in terms of the popular vote and in terms of the electoral college. The other thing that I think is very interesting is looking about age, that significant numbers of young people did vote for Trump. Much larger numbers just decided they wanted to stay home. They weren't energized by the prospect of voting for Harris. So, I mean, all of that has very interesting lessons for what comes next, but the ethnic and demographic breakdowns, I think, have to take all that into account.
We've touched on it briefly. What does the trajectory look like in Israel, Palestine, Gaza under a Trump presidency? And particularly, I want to ask if we do see an unrestrained Netanyahu, what impact does that have on global perception of the West in not exercising any accountability or restraint in terms of international rule of law and also of the security of Israel, which was created by and its existence rests on international rule of law?
So there's a few things here. Let's start with the trajectory when it comes to Israel and the occupied territories. The Trump administration last time round recognized Israel's annexation of the Golan Heights in complete, completely contrary to international law. The Golan Heights is a Syrian territory occupied in 1967 in the same way that the Sinai was, which was Egyptian. And then, of course, the Palestinian territories, East Jerusalem, the West Bank, and Gaza. Now, I think what's going to happen based on what we've sort of seen thus far, not in terms of course the administration, it's too early for that, but statements from different Trump-linked officials and politicians, there has already been a lot of talk around annexation of territories in the West Bank. The question is how much. In my opinion, the question isn't if, it's about how much. And I think what we're likely to see in increasing fashion over the coming period are Palestinians in the West Bank being forced to move to the main population centers, i.e., the cities and the larger towns, as opposed to villages and smaller areas where they might be. The shrinking of physical space for them to live in the West Bank. And then the annexation of large parts of it, and quite possibly the collapse of the Palestinian Authority, but it might be that that's sort of stalled for a while. When it comes to Gaza, Gaza has already become more like the West Bank in terms of the splitting up into zones, and there are maybe 3 or 4 zones that Gaza is going to have. In the north, which has now been completely cleared, ethnically cleansed of Palestinians, and the Israelis have made it clear they're not interested in having them back anytime soon, to the point where humanitarian aid isn't being sent there anymore because they say there are no Palestinians left up there. When it comes to the border area with Egypt on the Rafah, I think that will be heavily militarized. There might be some sort of arrangement with the EU to help manage the border, but that's an open question. And then below the corridor that cuts across from the sea to Israel, that will be quote unquote the safe zone. And that's where I think they want most Palestinians to be. We don't know how many Palestinians are left in Gaza. We probably have anything from 100 to 200,000 who have left already via Egypt over the past year. We don't know how many people are dead. The official numbers are the lowest estimate. I was speaking to officials in London over the last couple of days, and the full expectation is that whatever the numbers are that have been reported thus far, there are significant, substantial numbers far above that of people that are still being taken out from under the rubble. So it could be 100,000, it could be 150,000 people that have been killed over the past year. But that still leaves, let's say 1.8, 1.9 million people that will be in this very tiny area in the center of Gaza, where there will be, as there is now, famine, disease, very little infrastructure. That will be a problem, in a logistical sense, for not simply the Israelis to fulfill their ambitions, but, more widely speaking. And I don't think that that's something easy for them to consider. They can't simply say, well, they've got to leave. Which direction are they going to go? To the sea? Egypt will not, I think, accept becoming complicit in ethnic cleansing to simply say, sure, we'll open up so you can move them over to side. But it doesn't mean that the IDF is going to pull out anytime soon. On the contrary, I think they're there to stay. I think they've already appointed a quote unquote military overseer for Gaza. There's a similar office for the West Bank and has been for a long time. So all of that, I think, is going to be the way that Israel proceeds on Gaza and the West Bank. And I don't think that the Trump administration is going to stand in the way of that. I think that there will be one thing that perhaps the Trump administration will insist on, which would be that Netanyahu ought to say at some point that the war is over. But saying the war is over could be as simple as George Bush saying mission accomplished a year after the Iraq invasion, where of course it was not mission accomplished, and Netanyahu saying the war is over, but refusing to move troops out to end the occupation, to end the siege. I don't think we can really expect to see anything like that.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, and I'm speaking to Dr. H.A. Hellyer, Senior Associate Fellow in International Security Studies at RUSI. As we are recording today, a ceasefire has been announced between Israel and Hezbollah, ending, I think, 14 months of conflict. Why has this happened now? Has it anything to do with an incoming President Trump? Or was this in the pipeline and being worked upon, and it just so happens to be today that we have a fragile ceasefire?
I think a bit of both. I think that the moment that Trump won the election, prospects for a ceasefire in Lebanon actually increased because I think that the calculations of the Israelis and the calculations of Trump find a bit of synergy when it comes to Lebanon. That actually means that a ceasefire at this moment in time works. And I happen to think that it might stay working because the 60-day period that ends in a Trump administration. And I don't think Trump will want to have a new conflict erupt on his watch like that. On the contrary, he's more likely to take credit for this particular ceasefire idea. And frankly, he may be correct at least partially, because I do think that when it comes to Gaza, there's a much more short, medium, long-term set of priorities that the Israelis have that include holding on to the territory. When it comes to Lebanon, that's not the same. And that doesn't mean that the Israelis won't violate the terms if they feel that they have to. It doesn't mean that there shan't be further strikes or interventions or invasions. That's not the point. The point is that there isn't the same sort of desire to permanently settle, for example, in the south of Lebanon, in the same way that there is when it comes to Gaza. I mean, I didn't mention this about Gaza, but I expect that there will be Jewish Israeli settlements in the north of Gaza within a year or so, or at least outposts. It's a long-term thing in that regard, but not when it comes to Lebanon. Lebanon is about degrading Hezbollah. And I think that the calculation among the Israelis at present, and of course this is contested among the wider population in Israel, I think their conclusion is that they've really degraded Hezbollah, that they've gotten pretty much everything that they can out of, military force, and that this next track could redefine how Lebanon looks on a political level, where the Lebanese army is in control of the south, where Hezbollah as a national fighting force is not at the same level as it once was. And I think they will bank that as a win.
I'm Charlotte Leslie, and I'm speaking to Dr. H.A. Hellyer of RUSI. Turning to Iran, it was Trump who did what his predecessors did not and assassinated the commander of the IRGC's Quds Force, Qasem Soleimani. and also unilaterally withdrew from the JCPOA. What can we expect his strategy towards Iran to be?
I think that's an open question. We've talked about Israel, we've talked about Palestine. What his most major donor in the United States very publicly said that they had one issue that they wanted traction on, which was recognition of Israeli sovereignty over the West Bank, which of course they call Judea and Samaria. When it comes to Iran, within quote unquote MAGA republicanism, there are voices that want to escalate with regards to Iran, of course. You have people on the right in the United States that really want to take the fight to them. But then there are others that simply want to make a deal and are not looking to involve the United States in the Middle East even further than it is already. On the contrary, that they want to sort of withdraw as much as possible in order to focus attention elsewhere. So it's an open question. There was that interesting meeting that took place last week where Elon Musk engaged with the Iranians. And I think this is a reflection of where we are in history, where you're talking to me about the priorities of an incoming presidential election, and I'm responding, referring to the owner of a social media website, talking to the Iranians. But indeed, he will be a part of that administration in some shape or form. And I think that the idea of Trump being a deal maker as opposed to starting new wars goes down very well among the MAGA Republicans. I do want to caution people, though, just in case people get the wrong idea. He's not the peace guy. Okay, he's not the anti-war guy, but he doesn't want to be blamed for starting new wars. He wants to be cast as this deal maker. And that could mean, positive moves vis-a-vis Iran. It could mean negative moves vis-a-vis Iran. I think it's just too early to tell.
And finally, we've gone through the region, we've looked at America. Coming back to the UK, does and will the UK have a role to play? It's more isolated than it was from Europe post-Brexit, and now with a Labour government, which has made no secret of its views on Trump, although it may have tried to row back on those views now he's elected. Where does the UK sit? Can we play a convening role? What would that look like?
So I think the UK can play a convening role. I think that when it comes to previous statements by Labour ministers and Labour politicians on Trump, it seems that they've done quite well in building relations with the Republican Party and with Trump himself, despite all of that. One indication of this, I think, is that I think it was a month or so ago that you had the Prime Minister, and I think David Lammy might have been in that meeting as well, meet with Trump and have a fairly extensive conversation. The question will be what the UK can bring to the table. And certainly there are already signs of difference that are likely to come up again and again. You mentioned earlier on the program the rules-based order, views of the West internationally, in the global south, in Africa, in Latin America, in South America, in Asia, are not in a great place. But I'll say two things about that. One, the West is split on the Palestine question, support for Israel. You see that with Belgium, you see that with Spain, you see that with Ireland, but you also see it within the countries that have governments that are very supportive of the Israelis. So there's a big split in the United States itself on a popular level, not so much a political level, but on a popular level. And certainly within Europe, that split is much wider and widely felt. So I think that views of the West internationally also take that into account. But the fact is, when it comes to the rules-based order and international law, the strongest proponents of the systems that underpin that are now and have been for quite some time sort of fudging them when it comes to support for an ally, and in this case, support for the state of Israel. I mentioned this because, of course, a few days ago, the ICC issued the warrants for Netanyahu, for Gallant, and for Deif, but Deif is probably dead, the Hamas commander. And in my mind, there's really no doubt that if Netanyahu were to land in the UK, which I don't think he ever will, but if he were to do so, I've no doubt that the Labour government would fulfill the warrants, provided that it was done through the courts in the usual fashion. It's actually a legal decision. It's not so much the government's decision, but I think that they wouldn't stand in the way of that. The United States, on the other hand, is very much opposed to the ICC doing anything with regards to the Israelis, although they had no problem with the ICC when it came to Putin and his invasion of Ukraine. I think these are all very significant to keep in mind because the upholding and maintaining and strengthening of a rules-based order is not simply something nice for us to aspire to as, civilized human beings or something. It's incredibly necessary as we consider the crises that are not just already upon us, but are going to come across us as well. The climate crisis I'm thinking of in particular, but also just future conflicts and wars and, disagreements. We rely on international law. We rely on a rules-based order. And the absence of it is simply right is might and the law of the jungle. I'm not sure we've quite understood how destructive reverting to something like that would be, especially given the advances in technology in the 21st century. And I hope that more sound minds and level heads prevail in that regard.
Dr. Hellyer, thank you very much for your thoughts. That was a fascinating conversation.
Thank you, Charlotte.